Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant to talk to you all about parasites. See, across all sci-fi, parasitic aliens in particular are pretty much a staple, from the xenomorphs from Alien to the Flood from Halo. They're everywhere and generally come with some kind of horror element, though not always. Not all parasites are created equal, however, so I'm going to summarize 20 different parasites and then put them in a tier list of S down to F, based on how difficult they'd be to contain or defeat. This list is pretty subjective, so I'm totally okay with being wrong on some of these, and feel free to call me out when you think it's necessary. The Flood from Halo. Starting off strong, the Flood are so dangerous that the Halo rings were built by the Forerunners not to wipe them out, but to wipe out all their food. That is, all sentient life in the galaxy, because that was the only way of slowing their inexorable spread. The early stages of an outbreak really aren't that bad. Just shoot the little infection forms, and when they get a hold of people and infect them, just be sure and burn or dismember them, because they'll keep coming back, as long as there's infection forms around to get them back up. The real problem comes when they've hit a few levels of critical mass, where first they create a grave mind, which is highly intelligent and can even infect software for some reason, somehow. And once they get beyond that, they get into some reality warping abilities. They get ridiculous. The Flood are definitely S tier. Xenomorphs from Alien. Xenomorphs are ambush predators that are extremely durable and, once killed, have acidic blood that can melt steel. They spread by having their hapless victims stray too close to their egg pods, prompting them to open and releasing facehuggers, which then latch onto their victims and implant an embryo before dying and falling off. This embryo then proceeds to grow inside the victim before pummeling their way out of the victim's ribcage and rapidly maturing into a xenomorph, which has a variable configuration based on what it infected. The thing is, against prepared enemies, xenomorphs really aren't that scary. In Aliens, a squad of Marines who don't even know what they were up against took out literally thousands of the things before running out of ammo and ultimately ending up just nuking the infected site from orbit. Sure, they're deadly if they manage to get close, but the stories are in the context of spaceships and tight corridors and things like that. And in the first one, they didn't even have firearms. Even their form of reproduction is awful, requiring unsuspecting or foolish victims to blunder by their eggs and get infected, and even then, it's only one xenomorph per victim, so their growth is capped. Yeah, xenomorphs get a B. Terrormorphs from Starfield. You could argue that these aren't technically parasites, but they infest colonies, and you'll understand a bit more why they're more parasitic, truly, when I explain a bit. I feel like they were inspired by xenomorphs, so I'm including them because they're an interesting contrast. They're highly durable, super strong, and they have this aura of mind-altering powers that can drive people around them crazy and get them to start attacking their allies, and they just appear for apparently no reason on colonized worlds after the colonies have been there long enough. Well, that's the story initially, at any rate. Spoilers if you're worried. It turns out that terrormorphs are basically just adult heat leeches. Heat leeches are attracted to ship engines and can survive in space and are more of a nuisance than anything. So they end up spreading to anywhere that ships travel. And in the absence of sufficient pest control or predators, the leeches are able to mature and wreak havoc, even causing the total destruction of multiple colonies because even a handful of terrormorphs are difficult for military forces to handle, and thousands of them are just a calamity. Basically, once you know how to actually avoid having them show up in the first place, terrormorphs aren't all that bad. But once you have them, they're really bad news. Terrormorphs get an A. The Mars water virus from the Doctor Who episode The Waters of Mars. These nasty critters are waterborne, and coming into contact with even a drop of contaminated water will give them complete control of your body and mind, with the additional bonus of them being able to just vomit an endless stream of infested water by converting the host body into water at the atomic level. These things are apocalyptically dangerous, and even the Doctor couldn't actually stop them. The whole base had to get nuked in order to eliminate them. Clearly, introducing them to a water-rich environment like Earth would be a game-over scenario for humanity, but I'm not sure how good they would be at spreading from world to world, as at least when generating endless streams of water, they put a really huge strain on their host body, presumably shortening their lifespan. That said, they spread super easily, are nigh impossible to contain, and require drastic measures to destroy. A tier, possibly S tier if they figure out how to go Interstellar. X Parasites from Metroid. These are what Metroids were genetically engineered to destroy, and they've become a really big problem after the Metroids were driven to extinction. The X Parasites are basically indestructible, except to Metroids. and are capable of infesting and completely copying anything that they come into contact with, equipment at all. X-parasites are an existential threat to all life in the galaxy. They get S tier. Borg from Star Trek. They're capable of rapid movement around the galaxy. Anything that doesn't destroy them outright, they can just adapt to and ignore completely later on. And they can assimilate people and technology into their collective. The only real weaknesses of the Borg is that they have trouble adapting to things that they can't infest with their nanites, and they're a bit too dedicated to efficiency for their own good. Like, they keep sending 1 cube at a time at Earth, and then it gets stopped, and it's like, well, just send 5, That said, Borg have a massive technological head start over basically every other parasite on this list, so Borg are S tier. The cordyceps fungus from The Last of Us and Girl with All the Gifts. This fungus is a real thing, and it basically infects the brains of things like ants and mind controls them into acting stupid. The Last of Us and Girl with All the Gifts just takes that same concept and then applies it to humans, making zombie creatures, the clickers. Girl with All the Gifts in particular ends up with the spores getting airborne and just totally causing a global extinction event. The exception being the second generation of zombies, who are back to basically being human, but with some zombie bloodlust tendencies for vanilla humans. Basically, the children of the zombies are hybrids with the cordyceps fungus. They're super effective at spreading, but the zombies themselves aren't particularly dangerous, and their threat is not interplanetary. Plus, the airborne spores are counterable with a mask. Cordyceps are A tier. Vogans from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. These are the worst kind of parasites. Bureaucrats. They follow the letter of the law and enjoy adding more and more laws just to make things as convoluted and obstructed by red tape as physically possible. As said in the book, they wouldn't even lift a finger to save their own grandmothers from the ravenous bug bladder beast of Trawl without orders signed in triplicate, sent in, sent back, queried, lost, found, subjected to public inquiry, lost again, and finally buried in soft peat for 3 months and recycled for firelighters. For sheer bureaucratic frustration, I'm giving Vogans A tier. Headcrabs from Half-Life. These are basically hats with the munchies. They leap at victims and affix themselves to their heads, killing them and taking over their bodies. Once in control, depending on the type of headcrab in control, the now zombified person will have variable abilities from being a slow, shambling zombie to a fast or poison or even armored variant. None of these variants are particularly durable. Even with the armored headcrab, which is immune to headshots from small arms, is super vulnerable to just hits on its soft underside. And they're all relatively easy to put down. The slow ones aren't even that hard to take down with a crowbar. Headcrabs get a D tier. The Thing from The Thing. The danger of the Thing comes from the ability to quickly and perfectly mimic any living creature that it eats. The mimicry is so good that even friends and colleagues can't tell the difference, and this breeds a lot of suspicion and misplaced aggression. Basically, you can only catch them if you catch them while they're eating something new. They're also relatively durable, since they have a high adaptable body, making them really resistant to bullets and stuff like that, so you have to use more thorough weaponry, like fire. The Thing can also reproduce once it's consumed enough biomatter by just splitting off pieces into more creatures, all of which, again, are perfectly disguised. What the Thing is really capable of on a grander scale scenario is really hard to say. All we've seen them at is just an Antarctic research station, which had, a handful of guys at it. But even in the film, they figured that if it were let loose on the wider world, it would very quickly consume all of humanity. It even arrived via spacecraft, so clearly it's capable of spreading from world to world, though not under its own power necessarily. I'd call the Thing A tier at least, but depending on how innovative it is once it actually takes over people, I would call it more S tier at that point. Staro the Conqueror from DC Comics. This was the villain from the Suicide Squad. Not Suicide Squad, the Suicide Squad. They're different. And it's capable of rapidly assimilating thousands of people, taking over their bodies, while killing whoever they get a hold of very rapidly. That said, Staro is highly vulnerable to plot armor, as none of the Suicide Squad actually get taken. And ultimately in the movie it was taken down by a bunch of rats. So yeah, I'll rank Staro as B tier. The Goa Old from Stargate. This is an interesting one. The Goa'uld aren't actually particularly formidable on their own. It's relatively difficult for them to actually infect anybody, so typically the already infected will introduce the parasite to a new host themselves, and they're kind of cannibalistic, so their numbers are pretty limited. That said, Each Goa Old can live an incredibly long time by either changing bodies or through the use of a sarcophagus device, and each is born with the accumulated memories of its entire bloodline, leading them to conquer much of the galaxy. All that said, the Goa Old don't seem all that interested in actually improving societally. They just want to maintain their lavish lifestyle as system lords, so their technology is stagnant and their rulership is way too rigid, leading to rebellion. The Goa Old get a B. If they were more inclined to take advantage of their inherent advantages, I would rate them higher, but they just aren't. Symbiotes from the Marvel Comics. These are gooey creatures that affix themselves to other creatures, taking on their qualities while granting their host their own qualities. True, a lot of the time this is a mutually beneficial relationship, like in the case of Eddie Brock and Venom or, Carnage, but they aren't necessarily that big on consent, like in the case of Peter Parker, so that's why I'm including them as a parasite. The full potential of the symbiotes is unknown, but suffice to say they basically just take whoever they're bonded with and make them better. They're insanely durable, they can create weapons out of themselves, and while attached, both symbiote and host become basically amorphous, allowing them to move in ways that would be impossible for just the host. And they can reproduce by just basically leaving bits of themselves around and having those attached to things. Heck, Venom was created multiple children just by accident. Their only real weakness is high-intensity sound, which causes them immense pain and it can even force them to split away from their host, and once they're separated, they can't actually survive that long on their own. Symbiotes are definitely A tier, possibly even S tier, depending on what there's available to infest. Brain Slugs from Futurama. Okay, these guys are basically a parody of mind-controlling parasites from other IPs. They sit in plain sight on the heads of their victims, slowly consuming their brains while controlling their actions. Countering them is as simple as just removing the brain slug from the victim. No special technique, or tools, or anything left needed, and they die if left on their own for a while, or if whoever they're feeding on is stupid enough, they'll just starve. Yeah, brain slugs are F tier. Gene Stealers from Warhammer 40k. These are Tyranids which will sneak onto inhabited worlds and stay hidden while capturing and infesting the local population, creating a Gene Stealer cult, with all the members cyclically connected via a brood mind. Then, when a Tyranid hive fleet arrives in the region and consumes the world, the Gene Stealer cult will connect to the hive mind, provide them all the intel they want, so they can better adapt their invasion forces. And finally, when the hive fleet actually begins its invasion, the Gene Stealer cult will attack the enemy strongholds from within, destroying infrastructure and reducing their ability to defend themselves. The threat from Gene Stealers themselves is fairly limited. They're just not all that formidable, but in the greater context of the Tyranids, they're absolutely an S-tier threat. Jurk from the Animorph series. The Jurk are slug-like beings that infect sentient beings via the ear canal, and once there, exert complete control over their host's mind and body. They don't seem to confer any special abilities on their host, but they're driven to expand and infect as much as they can. Their main weakness is that unless they are actually on their home world, every 3 days they have to leave their host body, get to a Jurk pool, and absorb nutrients, or they starve. That said, they are highly driven to spread and difficult to detect when they don't want to be, but they have a pretty staggering weakness in how they need to feed, so I'll rate the Jurk as B tier. Souls from the host. These creatures are immortal unless killed, which happens fairly quickly outside of a host body, and they can exert either complete control over their host body or act as more of a symbiotic manner, though this is pretty rare. They don't confer any particular abilities upon their host, and if the host dies, they just find a new host or have to be placed in cryostasis, or they quickly die on their own. Mother souls also die while reproducing, but they generate millions of young when they do so. Their motivation is a bit different from most parasites. They're basically pacifists, and they infect whatever they consider to be dangerous or belligerent species to pacify them. How exactly they manage to conquer the world isn't really clear, so I'm going to rate them B tier since they're really not sneaky, they don't have extraordinary abilities, and they're pretty easy to kill. Ilids from Dungeons & Dragons. If you've ever played Baldur's Gate 3, which I highly recommend, you know plenty about Ilids, but suffice to say, they're crazy, dangerous psychic creatures who eat brains and reproduce by placing a tadpole in their host bodies, which then crawl in via the eye, and sometime later, the victim undergoes seramorphosis, during which they die, and a fully grown Illithid is born. That Illithid maintains all the memories from their host body. In their heyday, the Illithids ruled a multi-planet empire, but their enslaved Githyanki servants rebelled, and destroyed their empire, leading to massive reductions in their numbers and the loss of a lot of knowledge. It's a little awkward trying to rank Ilids since you beat them up with swords in-game, but technically you could take on any of these parasite groups with a sword. Is that maybe the thing? So if you really wanted to, it's just not that good of an idea to take on most of them with a sword. That said, they're also a considerable threat to people wielding literal magic, so I'm inclined to rank them at A tier, though I could be convinced to rate them at S tier. Squids from Invincible. Once again, we have mind control parasites. Squids are interesting, though, since they're basically just dumb animals and can be used as beasts of burden. But if they get even a single sentient mind under their control, their hive mind comes online and they become freakishly dangerous. They are very strong for their size, even capable of fighting, though not winning, against a Viltrumite. And for a while, they were quite useful to their Martian masters, who, being amorphous, were immune to infection, but a single human astronaut was infected, and suddenly the entire Sequin hive mind was online, and they quickly took over the planet and attempted to invade Earth, only being stopped by the Guardians of the Globe intercepting their ships and disabling their control over the astronaut long enough to shut down the hive mind. Had the ship made it to Earth, they'd have taken control of the population very quickly. Squids aren't really ever given that great of a shot in this series, but it's pretty clear that they'd be insanely hard to defeat if they managed to get a hold of a planet full of hosts. I'll rate the Squids as A tier, but as with Ilids, I could see them being S tier depending on how effective they were at using that hive mind for innovation. Last but certainly not least, the Old Gods from Warcraft. These are parasites on a whole nother level. They don't just infest people, they infest worlds. Most of the world-ending threats that have been faced over the world of Azeroth have been connected to the Old Gods in one way or another. And while the power levels and abilities of each Old God vary wildly, they are all insanely dangerous. They can muster massive armies of fanatical servants, invade the minds of those who are just around them too much, and if you do manage to kill them, they have a very good chance of destroying your world in the process. The best part, if they actually manage to do their job and corrupt a world soul like they've been trying to do since forever, and it's really only been divine intervention that stopped them, the creature that would result would be an unstoppable god of destruction. They are absolutely S tier. And that's the list. Let me know in the comments if you think I've over or underrated anything. I ended up with a lot of S tier threats here. Also comment if there's any parasites I missed and where you think they'd land on the scale. And until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.